Most things that we're taught as horse owners generally is usually the opposite of what you actually need to do with your land and horses. The more horses become competition animals, for instance, the more we dictate what they do down to the last step. If you can allow horses to be horses for 99% of the time, it's going to be far less stressful, and therefore you're going to have a far less stressed horse.
This episode is kindly brought to you by White Griffin, Westgate Labs and Simply Steam.
Hello.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good, how are you? How's your week been?
Yes. Yeah, good actually. I don't feel like I know what day of the week it is a bit, but I think it's Friday. We're recording on a Friday, aren't we? But we're talking to you guys on a Wednesday. But no, I've been having a good time. The mental state has continued on the up, and it's really cool because like things I'm actually like starting to enjoy. And I had an experience yesterday where I did something that was quite like nervous making, and I was saying to Rhi just before we started, like, it's really interesting. Like, I'm actually starting to find that I can actually enjoy things, not just like persevere through them or just go like experience it. And I think this is what most people feel a lot of the time. You know, like I find like things like going away on holiday so stressful because my body doesn't really know the difference between excitement and fear. And actually, like, yeah, starting to enjoy things. I'm like, oh, wow, okay. Yeah, like I took the dogs for a walk this morning and I was just like really aware of how beautiful things were. And I think when you're dysregulated and in that like state where your mind and your body are just completely up shit creek without a paddle for like a long time, you just forget how like absolutely magnificent life is. Like the sun on the trees and the blackberries in the bush and the dog that's just living his absolute best life joyfully running through the grass. You know, like, it sounds a bit mad, but if we're present enough, because we're not so living in the future or living in the past, life is really cool.
I really hope that we're doing the podcast, hint hint to any brands and sponsors who want to help us keep this going, but I really hope we're doing the podcast for the next like 5 years, because I really feel, Miri, that you are just about to enter your best era. Like, I can just feel it, and you know, things going on in the background and stuff. Like, it's going to be so good. It's going to be so good.
I didn't know this was possible. I just thought I was destined to live a pretty hard experience. I'm very sensitive, and I'm very sensitive to like things that happen to me and things that happen around me and the environment I'm existing in. And I think like I thought that just meant I had to be kind of like borderline on edge, borderline miserable, borderline all of those things. Yeah, I think I really have to give a shout out to Bev. I'd love for her to come on the podcast one day, maybe. She's a somatic therapist, and I've done with a lot of talking therapy, and I'm not negating the power of talking therapy. I think it's a magical thing, and sometimes it's exactly what you need. But I do think that I have been so dysregulated for so long, and I think my horses regulated me, which enabled me to do the job I do and still be fairly good at it. But I've never felt better with my horses since I've regulated my nervous system. And I had an experience yesterday where I had a really exciting thing happening, and I can say that it was exciting, but my body thought it was scary. And I sat in my car before the thing that was happening, and I love how I just can't talk about it. And
the speculations are going to be wild.
Wild. And I just did my like vagal nerve activation exercises that Bev taught me, and then I just did all this yawning, and then I didn't just experience the thing, I enjoyed it. I felt joy doing it, and it's really bloody cool. So I'm going to put Bev in the show notes, because I think everybody needs a piece of Bev in their life. She is life-changing, literally. How's your week been? That was quite the ramble.
Week's been good. Harley is great, but I would like to spend my intro portion talking about an update, because I'm really excited about this, and actually we've been forgetting to share it with you guys.
Really cool.
So, do you remember there was a lady who sent in a question to Miri and I think it was in season 2, about whether or not she should take the leap and go to a sole use yard with her friend, and at the end of it, Miri and I made a joke about rocking up with deck chairs and just joining in. Do you remember this? So, she sent me an update recently. And so she basically was like, hope everything's well, here's the update. So her friend ended up having to go back to the old yard, cue panic, and her husband trying to figure out, could they afford this yard on their own? They're stressed about the budget. They're stressed about their horse not having a companion. That is where we enter the message. And I'm just going to read you the rest. My husband and I worked through our finances and decided to keep the yard on ourselves. We then needed to find a companion, but I had no time to save up and really wasn't sure how we could do it all. So, enter Redwings. They absolutely came to the rescue, no pun intended, and after contacting them in desperation, they dropped off a beautiful little pony to us on Thursday. From start to finish, they were ace. We discussed what we were looking for and whether we were a suitable home, etc. We had a home visit from the lovely Barry, who approved our little yard and then invited us to meet a little pony. My mum came with me, she loves a day out, and off we went to the centre at Caldecott for a trial. As soon as I saw her, I knew she'd be perfect. The ladies were lovely too, and once my trial was over, we stayed for the day, had lunch, walked around meeting all the ponies, and my mum adopted a donkey. We then agreed a date and sorted over the handover paperwork, and I prepared for her arrival. Once again, it was so brilliantly done and organised by them. She's settling in very well so far. She's happy to come over for a scratch and a brush. So far, so good. It's been a great experience, and I'm so happy we went through Redwings. And she sent me pictures, so I'm going to show you Miri, because she's such a cute little mare. Look at this mare. So she's like
black and white.
She's a little
and
cobbler.
It looks like lovely little cobbler. She looks... Oh,
and this is them like
making
making friends over the fence. It was just, what a cute story. Like, I just love how so many of the companies and the brands that we so respect and the charities that we love, it's everyone's connected. And I just thought it was such a lovely story. So great.
I wonder as well, like if maybe she heard from us about Redwings. Like maybe then that
it was like front
sparked
of mind.
That. Yeah, front of mind. Yeah. Oh, that's really magical. I'm really, really pleased to hear that. And I'm also pleased to hear that, like, you know, we encouraged her to try and it's really worked out. You know, I think that's a really cool thing. I actually had a number of conversations with people this week, which was another reason that I really feel like, you know, things are going in the right direction. But that people were like, I'm very grateful that these people reached out to me and told me, but I'm also very grateful to get to do what I do. And I had a couple of people basically say to me, like, thank you for basically validating that it was okay to not think the way that people were doing things was okay. So what I mean is, like, people were like, oh, there are people around me doing not nice things. Is it okay to not be okay with that? And for me to be like, yeah, you know, you're doing the right thing, and to help them then shape that and change the way they do things. And I just feel so, so grateful to have this podcast where we have these amazing conversations like we had last week. You know, the feedback that we've had since last week's episode has been huge. And I think it's just a really cool thing that we're doing here. We're just going to take a moment before we dive into our guest today to talk a bit about our season sponsors, White Griffin, and we are going to be talking all about sustainable land management. Rhi, can you hit us with some facts?
So, I've got my little bit of paper. The UK, this was wild when I saw this. The UK has lost 50% of its biodiversity nationally since 1970. And it's really important for the planet and for the fight against climate change. If we leave it undisturbed, biodiverse grassland with the UK can store 2 billion tonnes of carbon in the soil. So it's a really good thing to have. But obviously it's hard to have good grass management.
And I think what is meant by biodiverse grassland is that we're not just seeing grass that is one grass type, like ryegrass, for example, which is very commonly sown when it comes to for cattle, for example. So trying to have different grasses, different like wildflower, that kind of thing. That's what we're talking about when it comes to biodiversity of grassland.
Yeah, and if you're lucky enough to be in charge of grass management where you keep your horse, there's really simple things you can do to just help with this. So one of them is allowing paddocks to rest before you put the horses back on them. Another is rotating the paddocks on a regular basis. And the third one is just giving space to nature to increase biodiversity. And that can be as simple as giving up your paddock borders or poor grazing spaces that can instead be used to plant trees and hedges. So it's really simple. If you want to learn any more about the resources that White Griffin have on this topic and Equestrians for Nature, you can visit the links in our show notes. Let's get back to the podcast.
Hello, Jane Myers, and welcome to the This Equestrian Life podcast. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you giving us your time this afternoon.
Hello. No, it's really wonderful to be here. I really enjoy doing this kind of thing. So yeah, it's going to be a good chat.
Great. We like passionate horse people, and I feel like you are a passionate horse person, so I think you're going to fit right in. Can you tell us, Jane, a little bit about what you do and maybe why you do it?
Okay, I'll try not to go on too long because it's a long story. But many years ago, when we still lived in the UK, I did a master's in equine science, and that led to me doing some research about grazing behaviour. Then fast forward to we emigrated to Australia, and while we were over there, things just happened so that I ended up writing a book about land management, and then from that we started doing talks, and from that the government started to sponsor us to educate horse owners over there about how to look after the land. And we were over there for about 25 years. Then we came back over here, and in that time we did a lot of teaching horse owners about land management over there. And then now that we've come back over here, we're fortunate enough to get the support of groups such as Natural England and the Wildlife Trust, because what we teaches horse owners how to manage their horses in conjunction with wildlife, rather than horse owners as if they're a separate entity. What we're actually teaching people is how to actually think of their horses as part of an ecosystem. In Australia, it's a bit too easy to get horses, just as it is here, in that because over there more people have land, there's more of it, and it's relatively cheaper. And because you've got really, really fragile soils over there, you've got these issues, all these things sort of come together, if you like, the perfect storm, and we end up with a lot of soil loss over there. So the government recognise this, and they're prepared to actually educate horse owners about how to keep soil on the land. And they're getting to that stage here now as well, because, yeah, it's an issue obviously here as well.
But because they have such dry weather, so then the grass root gets very damaged, and then it can basically just blow away.
Absolutely, yeah.
You end up with no.
They get
so you just
very
end up
dry
with soil.
weather followed by very wet weather, and interestingly, that's what we're starting to get here in the UK a lot more and more. So what we're actually seeing is, after 25 years of living in Australia, is that now very similar things are starting to happen here. So already here we're starting to hear about bigger bushfires and that, actual, fires on moorland here and that sort of thing. But other parts of Europe now are actually getting bushfires where they didn't before. And here in the UK, we're now starting to get more droughts, more heavy rain events and so on. And what this means then is that the land is getting highly stressed. So it's going from an extremely dry condition to then getting massive rainfall all at once. Which then literally just, if nothing else, as well as many other things, it washes the topsoil away. So you end up losing masses of topsoil, and that's what's happened in Australia and is now starting to happen more and more here.
So we're at a bit of a crucial point, maybe.
Yes.
And what I would be really interested to hear is the Equicentral system as such, for people who don't know what it is. Can you kind of outline a bit what you would be prescribing to somebody who's maybe a land owner or manager?
Absolutely. So basically, most things that we're taught as horse owners generally is usually the opposite of what you actually need to do with your land and horses. So, for instance, people tend to overgraze because they think they should be keeping their horses on super short grass. And really, land management is not something that's given a lot of weight to when people are learning about horses and horse management. And if they are, it's very traditional. So it doesn't really take into account many things that they need to know. So we sort of turned all that on its head many, many years ago in Australia when we had our own land over there. And for a start off, we looked more intensively at rotational grazing and the benefits of that. So because that's how land in the wild survives best. Large herds of animals pass across it, putting large amounts of pressure on, but only for really short periods of time. Then they move on to another area. In fact, they're moving all the time. And then that area of land gets a chance to rest and recuperate before other animals come along. And in the domestic situation, on a horse property in particular, that doesn't tend to happen. The grass is under constant stress, even if it's low level, but it's usually at a higher level. It's constant. It never gets a break. So that's why we end up with these highly stressed grasses and so on. So I'll move away from that point and just move into what we prescribe for that is that the equicentral system is about managing your land and keeping your land in a way that the horses live on it as if they would in the wild. So your rotational grazing for a start off. But because most horse owners right throughout the world generally don't have enough land, they always end up with more horses than the land can cope with. What you actually need is an area of hard standing at least, where the horses can spend some of the time, or however much time they need to, eating hay or eating any supplementary feed rather than just standing around on the land for many hours a day, which is what they do when they don't have an alternative. And what they're doing at that point is just wearing the soil out. So then you end up with more mud and more weeds and more compacted soil. As soon as you create an area that the horses can bring themselves to by leaving the gate open to it, you create an area that they can stand on. They will actually voluntarily stand on that area for many, many hours a day. All those areas that they would stand around just looking fed up at the gateway, instead, they stand around on this hard standing. And so if you keep your water there, so no water out in the paddocks, you just have one paddock in use at a time, and the horses bring themselves back to this area of hard standing. That's where the water is. That's where you feed your supplementary hay. If possible, that's where you have a shelter as well. It's absolutely incredible how simply this works. Suddenly, your pasture lasts twice as long. You can manage your pasture better. So, for instance, if it's a really, really wet day, there's no point turning them out. All they're going to do is gallop round for a little bit and then stand around for hours making mud. If instead they have hard standing, they'll stand out on there and eat the hay quite happily. Or if it's been dry for weeks and weeks and not rained, just the same, keep them in rather than let them shatter the grasses.
And you seem to be offering with your system somewhere between traditional management and
Yes.
And track livery. I think you're not a track livery. I think there are tracks on some of the systems I've seen, but there is also grass. So can you talk to us a little bit about your perspective on track livery and grass and how they should fit together?
That is actually a really complicated one because there are a lot of people who, it tends to be people going the other way around more. They're doing tracks and then they see our system. But in many ways, what we advocate is actually the opposite of tracks because because tracks actually are about deliberately overgrazing in one area of the land, which we would never advocate. On the other hand, when tracks are done properly, then that whole track would be surfaced. But generally speaking, people hardly ever do that because that would cost a fortune. So, for instance, if you have 10 acres and you surface a track around the outside of it, that's almost a mile of track. It might be a kilometre, I can't remember, but it's a lot. And it would cost an absolute fortune. So what we advocate actually costs a lot less because most horse properties in the UK, for example, already have what they actually need to create an equicentral system. They already have a stable yard often with hard standing, but up to now they've probably always fastened the horses in the paddocks, gone off to work, left them there in the paddocks and not brought them back in until they come back in the evening, for instance. When what we're saying is leave the gate open to the hard standing and you'll find that the horses will voluntarily go and stand on the hard standing rather than on the land. So with the track system, what people are tending to do is see how they would also like to be more, look after the land better. So what they tend to do is the central area, they might in winter use that as more of an equicentral system because the track becomes too wet in winter to use at all. Otherwise, it's literally like a soup of mud. But we would actually say that unless you're surfacing a track will actually lead to a lot of land degradation. The problem is once people have gone down that line, they've already done quite a bit of damage, or if they put a track in, they've already gone to a huge expense putting that in. Although, as I say, not many people do because it costs so much. On the other hand, if you've got a property that's already got miles of track on it, for instance, some of these big donkey sanctuary and so on, they've already got hundreds of miles of tracks already in. By all means, use them, but putting tracks in is a very, very expensive business. And in our opinion, it's not necessary. We've got lots of people doing it without that and having a fantastic result.
Do you think that this is something possible on livery yards? Because like as someone, I have a training facility and I have horses that come and stay, and I try and be good and pair them up often, or put them into small groups like 3s or 4s. And I'm very fortunate. I have got some horses now with me that are longer term. So these sort of environments would be absolutely suitable. I find it hard to know sort of how best to divide things up. And is there sort of like a land per horse size? Does this enable you in some ways to use your land more effectively, do you think?
Absolutely.
Like if you didn't have loads of space, you could still have these nice groups where they get their social interaction, but without needing like tons of space for them.
Right. Well, yes. So your situation where you have a training yard, that can be really difficult. Definitely with your more longer term horses, I would be forming a herd whenever possible. And with them, you can rotationally graze and so on. With horses that are just coming and going, I had that situation in Australia. I tended not to usually put them in with my own herd, because that's where you tend to get more injuries and so on. If horses are just coming on to your place for a few weeks or a couple of months or whatever, it's not always worth the risk of introducing them into your herd to then have to keep doing that, because that's where you tend to get more injuries happening, isn't it, when horses are not in as established herd. So I would be tending to like I say, pairing up can be a good idea, but I wouldn't necessarily integrate them into a permanent herd.
And so that's where understanding the benefit of the rotational grazing, maybe minus the equicentral system, but you're still very conscious of the grass use and the conscious of the way things are working, would then enable you not to end up with the problem of this soil degradation that you mentioned.
And if you add the hard standing, what the biggest benefit of that means that when your land is too dry or too wet, which it basically is nearly all the time, not all the time, but when you think of land, it's nearly always either too dry or too wet. But when you have that area of hard standing, you're able to remove that hoof pressure. Without that, then even if you're rotational grazing, you will always have times when the horses shouldn't really be out on the land, but they are, because you've got nowhere else to put them. Unless, of course, you've got stables and individual yards, which, that's different as well. But also, one little point I meant to say as well is, when you improve your grassland, and when the horses are only going out to graze rather than for hours and hours to just stand around and do whatever they want, they will tend to go out and get their heads down and eat. Because in the wild, this is what they do. They move to a grazing area to graze, and then they move to a watering area to drink, and then they move to a loafing area to do everything else, which basically is just stand around, swishing flies away, or whatever.
Scratching each
youngsters
other.
It might be playing, but sleep, all those kind of things, and they'll have loafing areas where they do that, and your hard standing is the equivalent of that. So what's happening in the wild is they have these very specific places and they move themselves around it. This is what happens with the equicentral system. So what I'm trying to say is that when you're trying to integrate horses into a group, you actually find with the equicentral system that they integrate quicker, because when they go out to graze, they go out and they're ready to graze, because that's what they do when they go out in the paddock, rather than standing around bored because they've been out there out at 8 hours already. Do you understand what I mean? So they'll go out and they will graze for around 3 hours. Then they will look to move on to having a drink. Then they will look to moving to go somewhere to loaf for the next couple of hours or so. And so because they then get into these routines, it actually vastly cuts down on a lot of any aggressive behaviour that you might see. However, that aggressive behaviour usually is mainly in horses because they've been cooped up for too long and separated for too long. Usually once horses get into a group situation, they settle incredibly well. But I do know you do have a dilemma with horses that are only coming on for a few weeks, whether it's worth it or not.
Absolutely. We see some very interesting, behaviours and changes. And I've got one group of mares that are particularly odd. I think they've all had some bad times in terms of being on their own, bad weaning, and they're a very funny bunch. When you drive up the drive in the morning, if you spy on them, they're all quietly sleeping together.
Yeah.
Like hanging out. And then humans arrive and they're like, oh no, I'm definitely not friends with her. Don't pretend. I don't want to pretend that I was friends with her. It's really, really strange. And they're in a group together now, just with large amount of, like, a lot of space. And I am very interested that if they were to have space that was inside, hay, outside, whatever it might be, whether that behaviours that they have known to practice would start to shift.
We also just want to take a moment to thank a brand new sponsor of the podcast, Simply Steam. Miri, you are somewhat of a steam queen, so tell us a little bit about why, can't keep a straight face, we practiced this before, that's how lame we are, why steaming hay is better than soaking hay.
So steaming hay has many benefits, and we're not just here to say that it's better than soaking, because if you don't soak your hay, there is still a benefit in steaming it. Steaming hay reduces bacteria and spores and mould in the hay. The steam actually reaches about 80 to 100 degrees C, and so what that's doing is it's actually making a sterile environment inside the hay, whereas something like soaking, you're just sort of washing the dust spores away, but you're not actually killing them. If you had a horse that had a cough, then steaming their hay is far more effective than soaking it, because they actually can still be ingesting the dust spores, for example. While we're on the topic of sustainability, Simply Steam's steamers are incredibly environmentally friendly, essentially. They only use 4 litres of water, which is actually a very small volume when you put them into jugs as such, and around an hour of electricity is used per cycle, which is the same actually as just boiling a kettle. Also, I want to mention that soaking hay, the water is actually classed as a pollutant, so has to be disposed of properly, whereas steaming hay doesn't create any waste. The water just evaporates to steam, and you are left with very healthy, tasty hay afterwards.
And of course, they are a Derbyshire-based family business, which means they also use locally sourced parts where possible. To learn more about Simply Steam and their products, head to our show notes.
Why is giving horses more choice and autonomy in their environment so important for their welfare? Because it sounds like you've done a lot of studying of this.
Huge. It is huge. I talk a lot about this, about giving them choice, because when you think about it, I know we shouldn't anthropomorphise about horses, but for some people, they actually have to think about their own situation for it to actually sink in. But for instance,
Absolutely.
Remember in COVID, how our choice was taken away, and how we ranged from people who could just about cope, but it was stressful, to people who absolutely could not cope with that level of being told what to do, being told that you can go out for 5 minutes and then you have to come, you can walk around the block and then you have to come back, and then you have, and so on and so on. And for many people, that was the absolute, they just could not cope with that, understandably. And when you think about it, this is what we do with our horses. And especially the more horses become competition animals, for instance, the more we dictate what they do down to the last step with their day. So we say, right, you're going to be in this stable for 20 hours. You're going to be turned out for 10 minutes in this indoor school with bandages on so you don't hurt yourself. And then you're going to be fed, you're going to be groomed and so on. We are controlling every single movement they make, aren't we? The opposite of that is that what we say is that if you can allow horses to be horses for 99% of the time, or whenever, all of the time when you're not interacting with them, basically, then the time that you are interacting with them is going to be far less stressful, and therefore you're going to have a far less stressed horse if the rest of the time the horse can be a horse. So we have to be honest with ourselves about what horses really want, and what horses want, if they're not too screwed up, for want of a better way of putting it, not too institutionalised, is even one way of thinking of it, and even they can often be improved quite a bit. Then what they want is the companionship of other horses. They want to be able to make their own decisions, and this is what the equicentral system does, is they decide as a herd, which is what horses do in the wild. Right, we're going to go and graze now. Right, now we've had enough grazing, we're going to go and have a drink. Now we're going to they get to make these decisions, which they've never been able to make before, or last time they did was when they were a foal, say, on a stud. That was it. And from that point on, their freedom was taken away from them. When you think about it, it's extremely powerful how to give an animal that much choice again. It's wonderful. It really is. And the amount of people I've had who said, my horse, I thought, he or she was a lunatic. And I've realised now that the poor animal just had no choice. It was, it was just so stressed. I mean, another way of thinking of it is, say to somebody who can't get it, imagine being locked in your bedroom without a TV and told nothing, basically, not knowing whatever's going to happen, apart from maybe it's going to pass you a meal in at 6 o'clock. And that's basically it. You'd go out of your mind, wouldn't you? And yet this is what we do to horses. When you really think about it, it's enough to make you cry. It really is. Because it's horrendous. And lots of horses live like that. Especially, for instance, dressage horses whose career can go on well into their 20s sometimes. Yeah. It's a long time to live in such a boring environment, isn't it?
And it is lovely. You are right. Like, even without a loafing area, so I keep my horse on a livery yard as Miri's yard, and it's so funny. Like, I can pinpoint if I come up at about 11 o'clock in the day. So my horse lives out overnight all year round and then in during the day. I know when he's going to be asleep. I know when he's going to be eating. It's so funny when they all go out at the same time. They all come in at the same time. Yes. As soon as they go out, they go straight to the trough, and you can tell what the pecking order is that day or whatever because of the order. And then you can pinpoint, depending on usually the time of day, where they're going to be because they have like you said, they have a routine of their own, and that's really lovely, actually.
It is.
So let's say with a livery yard like mine that has one yard, so our fields don't actually go straight onto the yard. We have to walk down a lane, etc. You wouldn't be able to sort of leave the gate open and have the yard open, and you've got groups of mares and geldings, etc. Is your recommendation for yards like that you build loafing areas into each paddock, or how do you sort of think about it like that?
It can be difficult, yes, on some properties. For instance, here in the north of England, a lot of properties have big dry stone walls and so on, which makes it very difficult to change anything. And we always try and say to people, try to change as little as possible. So if the paddocks can't link into a central area, again, usually there's some way of it. Might be putting hard standing in the gateway, for instance, like a large area of mud mats or hardcore rocks and that kind of thing. But anything to stop them just standing around in mud straight away is a big thing. But so look at the property in terms of it. I mean, it might be that property is on two sides of a lane, as you say. It might be that you build your central holding area on one side, but also one on the other side, maybe. In the past, people have often, the way to lay out a property has been to put a shelter in every paddock, for instance. So straight away we say, no, there's no need to do that. You only need one shelter. So if you've got several paddocks, you only need one area with a shelter, and that can then be a bigger, better shelter. But that shelter, the idea being that shelter is going to be in use every day of the year, if, depending on the layout of the property. So you just need to, most properties, when you look at them, there are ways you can do things like that, create an area for them to loaf in, for instance. And it might be that the fields that you were already using might already be on the too large side. It might be that they could be subdivided with a bit of electric fencing to make more rotational grazing, because the quicker rotations you have, the more grass you'll grow. So, for instance, if not having enough grass is a problem, then by splitting paddocks up with electric fencing, you can then greatly increase the amount of grass you'll grow, because that's what grass thrives on in the wild, as I explained earlier. It doesn't thrive on being grazed continuously. It thrives on being hit hard and then left to rest for a certain period of time. But your hard standing, what that does is just evens out those times when the grass hasn't had enough time to recover. But if every day you're allowing the animals to spend so many hours voluntarily standing on this hard standing, then they're not standing around on the land wearing it out while it's trying to grow. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
And do you think that actually a lot of the time we see these sensitivities to grass in our horses, like EMS, metabolic issues in terms of grass, like laminitis, that sort of thing, because actually horses are all eating this very stressed grass?
Yes,
and actually if the grass was better rested, then it's less dangerous. Is there information on that? Is there science?
Yeah, I'll explain a bit more about that. So, and It's really tricky because, so there's two different sides to this. You've got the grass and the horses themselves. So I'll start with the grass. So grass, when it's really short, the sugar that it's getting from, the sun's shining on it, the sugars are building up, but that grass is really short. So that means when a horse takes a mouthful of it, per mouthful, it's really high in sugar because the percentage in that short grass is really high, okay? When the grass gets longer, so I'm talking about, much longer, 20 centimetres or whatever, most of the sweet stuff is down the bottom of the plant. So when the horse comes along and takes a bite from the top, it has to eat all this fibrous stuff before it can even get to the sweet stuff. So that's one factor. That doesn't mean horse won't get fat eating that. It just means that there's more fibre in it, so it takes longer to get to that stage. Another little sideline to think of that as well is, if you're eating really badly yourself, you're eating loads of McDonald's because you're too busy and you're just grabbing really rubbish food all the time, and I don't know about you, but it makes me feel really ill when you do that. After a couple of meals, the first one you might enjoy, and it starts to feel really rubbish. And that's because what you're eating is usually really high carbohydrate food, really high sugar food, without any decent fibre in it. And you just feel hungry all the time, okay? It just makes you feel more and more hungry. And that's what's happening with horses that are eating really short grass. Because with horses, especially, what tells them to stop eating is when the fibre content of the stomach gets to a certain point. So when they're eating a lot of fibre, like hay or really fibrous grasses, their stomach says, right, it's time to go for a break now because you've got enough to be working on while you go and have a loaf, okay? But when the horse is only eating really short green grass, that never happens because the stomach never gets full of fibre. So what they do is they just keep eating and keep eating and keep eating. So that's one of the reasons why they then get enormous, because they're eating this really high carbohydrate, high sugar, high carbohydrate, same thing, grass. They're never feeling full. They feel hungry all the time like we do if we're eating rubbish. Never feel satisfied. So they just keep eating, and that's one of the issues that leads to this sort of catch-22 no-win situation where they're just getting bigger, feeling hungry, feeling more stressed, okay? So that,
Then you get this sort of desperation that people talk about, right? And I remember having a conversation. It was actually with Lily Wilson, who was on our last week's podcast, she's a holistic vet. And she said to me that if a horse goes without grazing or food for 15 minutes, that their starvation reflex is triggered. And horses are... this was from a vet, so people can fact check me, 100%. But it is interesting to consider, because horses don't have gallbladders, which we learned recently too, they're constantly producing acid. So if they're not getting a high enough fibre, because the grass they're eating is like McDonald's, this is going to be contributing to that issue as well.
It does, because if they're not eating enough, if they're not allowed to make their own decisions as well about when they need to eat, and if we're saying you will eat then and then that's it, you're gonna have to wait till I get there with the next lot of food, then again that acid is building up in their stomach, and this is why we get things like crib biting and weaving and all these behaviours, and this is why. The poor horse is hanging his head over the door that bites everybody that walks past, and they wonder why, that kind of thing. It's because this horse is uncomfortable, or in actually worse than that, he's in pain, or even worse than that, he's got ulcers because this acid is building up. We should be thinking in terms of them eating better food, but more of it, not less food, okay? Because with us, less food is fine, but with them, they need more food most of the time. Even fat horses often need more food, but they need more low-calorie, low-energy, low-sugar food to be healthy, right? So that they've always got that going through the gut. So with horses, it doesn't take long for them to feel that hunger, but the more fibrous their food is, the longer it takes to get to that stage. So horses will happily actually loaf without food, but it might be there in the yard, like, hey, you see them not eating it, but that's their choice. They're happy to do that 2 hours or more. They don't actually be eating that many hours. It's just that they need it there so that when they need it, it's there, rather than waiting for somebody to bring it to them, which causes stress.
Yeah.
I think what Lily's point was that it's about this depriving them.
Yes,
if they go
absolutely.
without completely and they're in a stable
Access.
full of
Yes,
shavings,
that's right.
If they have permanent access, then
Yes.
you never see
They're
this.
so stressed about food. They're so stressed about the whole thing of food. When are they going to get it? Are they going to get enough? You know, and they're feeling hungry all the time. That they just eat, you know, they just, whatever chance they get, they eat. So when horses are switched from always being on a restrictive diet, which is common in the way horses are kept traditionally, to being allowed to graze, you do have to be careful how you switch them over. We actually talk about it's best to do it through the winter rather than the summer, because you're going from saying to horses, right, no, you can only have this and it's going to weigh that much, and, you know, when that's run out, you're going to have to wait 6 hours till I come again. Instead, you'll be allowing them to graze much more. Initially, you build it up very gradually, but even so, it's still better to do that in the winter with hay, so that by the time the spring comes with grass, they're already used to being able to eat more. And some horses adapt really well. Some horses do adapt to that, going from, you know, feast to famine to feast sort of situation. Some horses are so far down that metabolic disorder pathway that they might never actually be able to do that. You might always need to, say, use a muzzle. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen, where they're so damaged, if you like, because basically we've micromanaged them their whole life. They're so damaged that they no longer know how to eat safely anymore. That's the problem. But as I say, a lot of horses do make it. You know, it might take a couple of years to change them over.
So for horses who are getting regular, appropriate turnout and access to forage, obviously we've talked about the type of grass and rotating paddocks and also loafing areas. Is there anything else in your research or in your talks that you think is really central or important for horses' welfare or choice?
How you actually manage the herd can be important. So, for instance, even though we often talk about how horses are meant to be herd animals, which is perfectly true, and so on, we also have to accept that in the wild they would pick their own herd mates to some extent. Like they would, meaning just in the wild, horses live in a group of usually one male to about 5, 6 or 7 females and their offspring. Okay. So in the domestic situation, for instance, if you've got 4 geldings and 3 mares, it might work, but chances are it won't, because that is a totally unnatural grouping. So if you have on your yard, that's why often, in fact, you know, people do often have a mare group and a gelding group. And it doesn't harm to, say, have one gelding with that mare group, because that then sort of is more of a natural grouping. But to have one mare and 7 geldings is not likely to work. Very occasionally it does, but it's not likely to, is all I'm saying. You know, people always say, oh, it works for me. But yeah, generally speaking, it's not going to work because it's not a natural grouping. So think about that kind of thing. But other than that, really, once you get horses out in the paddock situation with adequate grazing, they don't really need toys or any other kind of stimulation other than somewhere to shelter, somewhere to be able to go and get their own water, preferably where they actually have to walk to get it rather than it being right there under their nose. Because what we're also trying to create is movement. So by them having to go, right, we've finished the grazing bout now, chaps, shall we go and have a drink? Yeah, let's go. And they all go off, troop off and have a drink. You want them to actually have to move as far as possible to get that drink, as far as possible. I mean, we've had some funny, over the years, we've had people say, well, my property, things like, people have said, my property is 10 acres, like, if I put them in the far paddock, will they actually get it? How they've got to walk back to the yard to drink? We go, they'll get it in the very first day. And they do. They always get it. You know, they won't stand around waiting for somebody to bring water to them. They will go looking for it. You know, they will. And that's what you want them to do. You want them to have to walk off and get things. And then when they've finished loafing, they'll walk themselves back out to the paddock. But so other than that, then they don't really need much more than that, because that's what they would have in the wild. Yeah. But on the other hand, things like branches on the floor for them to scratch themselves on. In the old days, we'd have tidied all that up. It's funny how many things, and this isn't just with horses, how many things, as you get older, as I am, how many things turn around completely and come back, you know, full circle. Because things like people, when we talk about mulching with hay, which is another subject, where the what's left from a big round hay bale can be used to recreate soil in soil damaged areas. But when you say this to horse people, they're like, oh, but I've been clearing that stuff up and throwing it away for years. And we're like, but actually, it's actually like gold dust. That stuff is fantastic. It's full of manure, rotting down hay, and you can use all of that to actually massively, improve your soil. So, things like that.
Do you literally just lay it on top of the mud?
Yes. So
if you had I've got a couple of very...
in Australia, what was really interesting was because it tends to be too dry over there, but it's not always, it can also be extremely wet. Instead of feeding your round bale, when the land is very dry, for example, and people used to do this a lot in Australia, instead of feeding a round bale on the hard standing, you could feed that round bale in a gateway that's currently is really, all perched, but rock hard and dried out and so on. Just only allow them to have access to that area, enough area around it to eat the round bale, and then close that area off to them for a few weeks, especially if it rains or whatever, and that area will then turn into grass. Because the rotting hay and the manure that's mixed in with it makes fantastic compost for growing grass. So not to mention the round bale is full of seeds. So it's like for free, you get all these problem areas being turned into grass again, when it's dry. That works particularly well when it's dry, for instance. But it can work when it's wet as well, as long as it's not too wet. But the trick is, as soon as they finish, to get them off there and let it all break down and turn into grass.
I'm just imagining someone listening to this who's like, I've spent the last 5 winters trying to scrape all that up and da-da-da-da.
It's amazing to think that actually doing less can do more. I rent an old stud, and the fields are not divided up well at all. They're enormous, some of the fields, and there are some of the gateways that just never recover. And I'm sadly not really in control of my grazing at this point. It's really difficult, and so I just have to do the best I can with the circumstances that I've currently got. And I would love to. I've heard about this mulching, and I'm like, oh, I'd love to put a bale of hay in that gateway, but I'm not able to do it. And it's so interesting to hear you say how transformative that can be, and just changing our, seeing someone else doing it, seeing the proof and being like, I'm just going to try that, and then it changing everything from all of these trodden gateways to beautiful grass again.
While we're on the topic of land management, something that goes hand in hand with grass and grazing and the way that we keep our horses is worming, which is why one of our sponsors of today's podcast is Westgate Labs, who Miri and I both use for our worm counts. Miri, hit us with the facts.
There's some important things that I'm going to say right now, guys, so buckle up and get some pen and paper maybe. Gone are the days of blanket worming. A test-based program using worm egg counts and other tests is essential for every horse and every yard. Westgate offer consultations for horse owners and yard managers, and with just a few thoughtful choices, you can help reduce your reliance on worming chemicals, support natural ecosystems, and keep your horse and their grazing environment thriving. Did you know that when you worm a horse, the amount of chemical that gets passed through the horse can almost be 100% of it, so 80 to 98% of an oral dose of ivermectin passes straight through the horse without being metabolized. So that doesn't mean that it's not doing its job on the inside of the horse, but it means that a lot of that chemical is just being passed straight through the horse. So that's why it's really important to have protocols like after worming, horses stay in for 48 hours to make sure that not only are they not passing worms, if they have them, onto the grazing, but that they are not passing that dung that is full of the chemicals, because what that can do is it kills the invertebrates, the beetles that are living in the ground. It can leach into the waterways as well. So it's really important that we are aware of these sort of things so that we can make sure that we're looking after the environment that our horses are living in and not disrupt the ecosystems. So I've got some key paddock management practices so that you can look at what you are doing and see if maybe you can change what you're doing to maybe go to best practice. So rotational grazing, you can divide pastures, rotate horses and rest fields to break the worm life cycles, because the worm works by being ingested by the horse. It then lives in the horse's body. It is then passed out of the horse and in an egg form. It then lives on the grass. It is then eaten by another horse. And so the cycle continues. They're not like earthworms. They're not eating earthworms. They are being ingested as eggs. And that's how the cycle continues. So when we rest fields, if they're no longer being ingested, then they just die on the grass. They don't turn into worms on the grass itself. Poo picking, collect droppings at least twice a week to reduce worm egg contamination. Leaving a few fresh dung piles can help the dung beetles. Cross grazing, grazing pastures with other species like sheep can help break the equine parasite cycle, because horse worms don't live in sheep. So if sheep eat those eggs, they can't survive as such. And then just to avoid overstocking and overgrazing, provide enough space and allow fields time to recover. Any horse owner can take advantage of Westgate's award-winning tests with their expert advice included by using the code EQLIFE10 to get 10% off. This is excluding Equicell tapeworm tests and the subscription plans. And as somebody who has a lot of horses and who takes their worm egg counting life very seriously, the help that Westgate can offer is really enormous. So if I've just spat a load of information at you and you feel a bit confused, please do reach out to Westgate. They would be very, very happy to help.
By the end of our one-day workshop, we've actually taught people how they need to do less to achieve more. Exactly that.
Amazing.
That's cool.
So many of the things that we do with horses are really time inefficient. And a lot of the reasoning for that is because how we keep horses, much of it goes back to the military, and that is all about creating routines and basically giving these young lads something to do with the whole day. A lot of it is just a total waste of time, not all of it, but some of it.
But it is often very labour intensive.
Very labour intensive, so... But instead what we emphasise is doing, eventually when you get it right, doing far less. And then you can spend more time doing the stuff you want to do with your horses. So coming back to tracks, again, people, and I'm not knocking tracks, because some people they do work for, but we just say that we think there's an even better way. But it's very labour intensive. It still involves carting all the hay out all the time and picking up all the manure, and it's very labour intensive. So some people actually like, believe it or not, being labour intensive. That's actually what they enjoy about having horses for some people. Some people don't ride anymore, for instance. They actually enjoy having that routine, which is fine. But for busy people, they just don't have that time, and then they end up not having time to ride.
Do you believe, because I think this question is going to come up when we talk about tracks in this way, do you believe it is possible to heal horses with grass sensitivity like laminitis, which a lot of the track with surface people will tell you is that horses aren't designed to eat grass at all? Do you believe that it is possible to heal those horses with an Equicentral system?
It is possible, because we have a private group for people who buy our online course, and there are people in there definitely who've done that. But as I say, there's always going to be some horses who you can't, and not just that. If you have your own, like as we did in Australia, we were lucky enough to have our own 100 acres, so we were totally in control of what we did on it. Here in the UK, people are much more likely to have their horses on livery or be renting land that belongs to somebody else, and so they have less control over what they do. But going back to that livery situation, it might be that you just don't have the freedom to be able to do what you need to do, so therefore it might be that something like a track, as long as it's surfaced, is the only thing that's going to work, especially if that's what they've got in place anyway. Obviously you can't go off and do something different if that's what the livery yard is it? Or if it's a traditional livery yard and all the horses go out singly or in pairs or whatever, then it's going to be difficult to create an Equicentral system, for instance. However, you can still do it in a mini way, to be honest, if you've got enough area. But getting back to that about tracks, if you don't have control, then that might be your next best option. If you don't have control of that land, that could be your best option. But what we're trying to do is get landowners instead thinking again about the land management, rather than allowing so much land to become degraded, which is what happens with an unsurfaced track.
I'm flipping, because the other side of the question, which I'm trying to imagine, is like, oh, if I bought land tomorrow, how would I keep my horse? And I often think about this because I keep my horse currently on full livery. I have a corporate career. I see him every day, but it's difficult in terms of timing and travel for work and whatever. But he lives out overnight all year round, which I love. Right. And I often think if I had my own land, actually, he probably wouldn't have a stable to be in at all. He'd have a shelter and there would be space so that we can tack up and groom. Yes. But I'm almost imagining, like, is the ideal scenario as you see it in the UK, grazing that you rotate and split up, a hard standing loafing area, presumably maybe some undercover because it's the UK and we want a place to keep our groom and whatever, but that's kind of it. Does that feel...
Yes, absolutely. And even down to things like if you create an area for riding on, and this is what we used to do in Australia all the time, that area can be dual purpose. It can be an area that can be used as a loafing area, but you can also use it as a riding surface. You know, some people are horrified at that, but that's only because they've never thought that way.
Yeah,
you know, on the other hand, people build arenas and then only might use them a few hours a week, if that. But if you use them instead as a loafing area, but then put the horses into individual yards and then use it as your riding surface, I did that for many, many years in Australia, and it was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, that's a really smart way of looking at it.
Do you think that there's a kind of an option, I suppose, if people are on DIY yards and they are given like management of their paddocks? So it's like quite often I've heard of a lot of places where somebody says, right, here is 2 acres for your one horse. This is your space for a whole year. Do with it as you please. In those situations, who's somebody who may not want to put in a load of infrastructure, would you suggest things like, so the horse comes into a stable some of the time because that's their allotted space, and there's 2 horses, say there's 4 acres and there's 2 horses, for example, for a whole year. Would something like using mud mats and sand potentially in one area, so you have your water at one end and then you have your loafing area that you've created, it doesn't have a fence, but it has hay on hard standing. Is that like a good interim? I'm trying to think of the ways that we can encourage more time out, but without the destruction of the grass, but without this potentially big, I can't do that because I'm not in control.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, so, and then that is a very common situation for people in the UK, that they actually rent the land and stables that goes, say, with a big house that somebody's bought, but they only want the house, but they don't want the land. That's a common scenario.
Yeah, yeah.
And again, just a little aside from that, if you manage it with an equicentral system, you're not going to upset anybody in terms of what the land ends up looking like, whereas if you do something like a track system, you are, because you're going to end up with a big ring of mud around it, so that's going to create enemies straight away. So that's another issue. But yeah, getting back to that, mud mats are fantastic for that. And it's not just the fact that you can take them with you when you go. A lot of areas in the UK, you're not allowed to put down anything more than that.
Planning permission stuff.
Or whatever. So mud mats are brilliant for that. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. We used some last year.
You can put a bit of a fence around that area anyway, like an electric fence area. I'm not keen on horses being fastened in by electric if it's a really small area, but just say, like you said, you've got 2 horses, and as long as the area, as long as they're not feeling like they're stood right between, an electric fence and can't move, then there's no reason why you can't put an electric fence around there. Electric fencing is absolutely brilliant for managing horses. I'm just not keen on it when horses are forced into a small area with it, which is again a problem with tracks sometimes, is they're between 2 electric fences and they can't get past each other properly, so it can lead to a lot of stress.
Is there a benefit for you for having some kind of fencing, whether that's actual fencing or something else, around the loafing area, as opposed to say having it as part of the land? Let's talk about that.
Well, so if you didn't have those mud mats fenced, you would find that you'd have mud mats and then you'll have a ring of mud, and then you will have grass.
I see, because they're half on, half off.
Unless it's really big, which it's not going to be because mud mats are quite expensive, you will still get a lot of mud happening where they'll constantly keep stepping from the grassy area onto the mud mats, and they'll walk and they're putting a lot of pressure, so you'll end up with a lot of mud around them, which will destabilise the mud mats that are doing their job as well. Whereas if you put a simple electric fence around that area so that the horses have to walk in and out of that area as they would a gateway, which you can then put a bit of, a bit extra mud mats down and create like a, so that you're actually not having that area.
There's not like an edge. There's no edge as such. It like tapers.
Just the same as if it was personal rail fence, but instead it's with an electric in a gateway. Yeah, that would be better. But it still is better than nothing. I have seen that. I mean, I was at Red Wings once, and they had exactly.
Yes, they have it in the donkey fields.
Area in the gateway.
Yeah,
but there was still a ring of mud around that, and then therefore more weeds and stuff, which aren't always necessarily that bad. I think it depends what they are, but still, you don't want that bare, compacted soil and muddy bit if you can help it on the edge of that, and a fence will completely stop that. Instead, you'll have grass coming right up to the edge of where your mud mats start, if you can put a fence right there. Yeah.
It's really nice, Jane, to speak to somebody who obviously knows a huge amount about land management and obviously has a really deep passion for this, but you're very open-minded about everybody just doing the best they can, and I think
not being a purist. That's what people we like on this podcast.
Yeah.
Funny story about that though, and I mean, as I said, I'm not that young anymore, so I spent when we first moved to Australia and had 100 acres, and Stuart, who now does all of our talks, is absolutely brilliant, and people absolutely love him when he does our talks.
I can't wait to come to one of these talks, by the way. I'm so excited. This is really up my street. Yeah.
But when he does them, he describes himself as not a horse person, even though he is, because he's lived with me for 45 years and I've always had horses up until very recently. So he is a horse person, and he really does know his stuff. But what I'm getting around to saying is that he spent probably the first 30 years saying to me, why do you do it that way? Why are you doing that when it takes far longer, it costs far more? And it's just pissing the horses off, basically. And I've been like, but that's how you do these things. I spent so many years being so traditional, because I had that traditional background. And it took a long, long time to break down those barriers and start thinking a different way. And this is where you need people who don't have that traditional background, who see things from a different way. And then I started to take that on board, and now I'm completely the opposite. But what I'm trying to say is, even people who are so set in their ways can change when they're shown a better way. And people come to our talks all the time and say, I wish I'd known this 30 years ago, and I would have done everything differently. Because, it is a breath of fresh air. But for us, it's taken a lifetime for me to change. But, people now are starting to, I think, open up a lot more. We're starting to know how important things are, like letting animals carry out their, natural behaviours as much as possible. That kind of thing, We're starting to be able to see the importance of that. So people are going and younger people now, I just love the way that they're so open-minded. We were never, I wasn't like that at that age at all, because I was so indoctrinated into thinking the way I did. So people can change and will change in the future.
Well, I hate to say it. I don't hate to say it because I'm about to say it, but I think we're very precious about our individual horses, and I actually think we can learn so much from farmers, some farming. Like I grew up, my dad was a shepherd when I was growing up on a huge farm, thousands of acres, thousands of sheep, and there's just no way that you would do the amount of labour intensive stuff with sheep or cows that you would do with an individual horse. And so even learning from that, I went looking at retirement liveries a couple of years ago for a horse of mine, and they're kept much more similarly, I would say, to like cattle when they're retired, which sounds, I think, people would be like, oh my God, but actually it's just like, this makes sense. You're giving them the same things, friends, feed and forage, but you're just not doing it in a way that's like taking them in and out of an individual stable, which, do they even want to be there? You're adding hours onto your day, all the cost of the hay and the straw. Like, it's very interesting.
A couple of points to add to that is one, another situation where you'll tend to see it more like that is on a stud. You won't see, they're not treated as individuals as such, they're treated as herds.
I have seen the power of co-regulation. I get a lot of very problematic horses, the ones that people can't handle, that it's a no-hoper, it's a this, it's a devil, it's a da-da-da-da-da. And the absolute... Like, we do have stables, and I will probably always have to have stables because of this. You couldn't just put a dysregulated horse in with a regulated one and hope for the best, because they probably would hurt each other. So you know, having space. And our barn is lovely because our horses, the walls aren't high and they can all see each other, and they all, you really feel like an energetic shift when we have a new horse. Like, the new horse will come and they're like, I don't know how to handle myself, I'm completely all over the place, da 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 da. And the reality is my regulated horses who have been with me for a long time, you can see them, like, they'll meet the energy a bit, and then they'll all start to bring the energy down. And I wish that more people could, like, see the benefit of this co-regulation. Like, I'm quite good at training horses, fine, but I'm no good at I can't do what a horse can do. And the co-regulation is magical, and my cockerel is really going for it right now. Sorry about that, everyone.
My biggest example of that was when we had 35 horses at one point on 100 acres, and the paddocks were around 30 acres each. And I got a little pony he'd been kept in a small yard for years and years, and he used to attack everybody who came near him, literally attack them. And he was given to me to take and then to rehome, to sell on or whatever. That's what I was doing at the time. And I took him. He even attacked the person who picked him up for me. To just cut a long story short, got him home to our place. Literally, he was only a little 11-2, and I knew our herd. They were all pretty established. So I just put him out with them. I knew he couldn't damage them. We didn't touch him for 3 months. And after 3 months, and he was a really well-educated pony. He'd been a really high-level show pony in the past. After 3 months, he was an absolute dream pony again. He was totally calm. All his education was still there, beautifully schooled, everything. But when he came, he had massive fat lumps on him. Feet were a mess, everything, and we just let him go. And this is on drier Australian grasses, but we just let him go, so he was quite safe. And he came back slim, complete change in behaviour, absolutely different. And when I did rehome him, it was in an adult, so that then after that he was getting, you know, regular exercise, but he didn't have all that stress of being a show pony anymore. But it was lovely to see.
I have a closing tradition on this podcast. It's become a bit of a thing. And I ask us the same question, and that question is, if, Jane, you could tell every equestrian in the world one thing, what would it be?
It would be learn about horse behaviour. Learn what horses need and want, rather than assume that you know what they need and want.
There we go. And on that note, Jane, how can we find that information? Would it be best if we just put your details below in the show notes, or would you like to tell us a bit about the services you offer?
Well, we have a website, so that's equiculture.net, and on there we've got lots of videos. So, for instance, that's what I meant to mention earlier. We've got the one on the mulching, we've got one on dung beetles, which is something we mentioned today, and that's absolutely fascinating, is dung beetles. Forget having to pick up manure, they do everything, because they're the world's dung management experts.
Amazing.
And so on. So we've got lots of free videos on there, lots of blog posts and all that kind of thing. We do have a very inexpensive course. We've got books. There's all sorts of things on there. So our website's the best place to find out about us. We're also on Facebook. We mainly do our talks within the UK now, and they're usually funded, as I said, by the Wildlife Trust. For some reason, a lot of those have been down the south of England in the last year or so. So we've been doing them down Devon, Cornwall, Kent, that kind of thing. Usually anybody can go along to them, and they're usually funded by that body, so they're free to go to. We've done them even at the rewilding project a couple of years ago, and we had lots of people going there. Is that where you live?
No, I'm just very excited by rewilding. I think it's incredibly interesting. Well,
this is basically what we're teaching people, is how to rewild using their own horses. That's what we are teaching in a nutshell.
So cool. Maybe we should do another episode on this.
Yes,
I think so.
Mini one.
That's basically what we're teaching people how to do. You end up with a rewilding situation, but yet you can still interact with your horse, but you're getting all those benefits of rewilding your land. And that's why we get funded by the Wildlife Trust, basically, because we are teaching people how to provide land for wildlife along with their horses.
That's amazing.
So, yeah,
and I guess you must see, I'm really passionate about this. I've watched that the docu-film about rewilding in Knepp, and I think I'm a real environmentalist. I'm like, yes, let's fix the problem. But things like, do you see owls coming back? Do you see the wildlife starting to return?
people who start managing their land better, people who start looking after their land first and then letting that look after their horses, so that's in the right order, then they'll start to see, just like down at Nep did, you know, butterflies and insects, lots of other insects and all sorts of things coming in, because they will all live in conjunction with horses quite happily. You know, we that's what horses, you know, how horses are meant to live. So instead of traditionally we've just looked at that land being just for the horses and tried to kill everything else, you know, whether it be plant or animal that came on it, instead we need to be looking at that land as an ecosystem, and the horse is just part of it. And once we start doing that, all sorts of amazing things happen. You know, not to mention to your own state of mind. It's just wonderful. It really is. Saves you money as well. It saves you time. Makes your horses healthier and happier. So that's why at the end of our talk, people usually go away, you know, completely changed. They might come in at the beginning with their arms crossed sometimes, a bit looking a bit, I've only come
sceptical.
She made me or whatever. And then, it's funny. We often have husbands who come and shake our hand at the end and go, "You've just saved my marriage." Like, everything that I've been fighting against for years, a lot of what I've been saying is actually right. And she's now starting to realise that we don't need rows of stables and we don't need this, that and the other. We need to start thinking of the horse as a horse and let him be a horse and look after the land in conjunction with that.
Profound. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane.
You're welcome.
What a privilege.
It's been wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful. We will put your details below in the show notes. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to this episode, and thank you, Jane, for coming and sharing your wisdom. We really, really appreciate it.
I feel like my brain is rewilding at the moment.